Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into one of the most fascinating and, honestly, one of the most misunderstood mysteries of ancient human survival. For generations, we've all carried around this super vivid, almost stereotypical image of prehistoric life, right? We picture these tiny, isolated bands of hunter-gatherers, huddled around a campfire, basically trapped in a cave with the exact same relatives for thousands and thousands of years.
And honestly, when you think about it, the logic seems absolutely unavoidable, doesn't it? Like, if there are literally only 20 people living in your camp, eventually everyone is going to become someone's sibling, cousin, aunt, or, mysteriously familiar looking grandfather. It really just feels like this claustrophobic, incestuous nightmare was an absolute inevitability of early human biology. We just kind of assumed they accepted it because, well, what other choice did they actually have?
Okay, so let's dive right into this. Section 1, the prehistoric inbreeding myth. Moving right along to Section 2, what the DNA actually shows. We've assumed for so long that these ancient communities were basically sealed biological containers. But here's the thing. To shatter this myth, we don't have to rely on guesswork anymore. Ancient DNA has officially entered the chat. And let me tell you, it has completely rewritten the script on how our ancestors actually built their families. Seriously, just think about this number. 1. Out of a massive, sweeping survey of 1,785 ancient genomes, we're talking individuals from all different regions, completely different time periods, researchers found only one single individual who carried the genetic pattern of parents who were first-degree relatives. That means a brother and sister, or a parent and child. Literally just one out of almost 1,800. No way, right? When you look at the breakdown of this data, that tiny sliver of first-degree relatives is practically invisible. And what about first cousins or similarly close relatives? Still, substantially less than 10% of the parental unions in that enormous sample fell into that category. That means over 90% of ancient humans were reproducing with distant relatives or completely unrelated people. So, yeah, sure, ancient humans sometimes reproduced with family members, but the data definitively proves they worked surprisingly hard not to. Which, of course, leads us to the ultimate question. How on earth did they do it without birth certificates, family trees, or, a DNA testing app on their phones? To really understand how we know this, we need to take a quick peek at the biological receipts. Scientists use this incredible genetic marker called runs of homozygosity. Without any written records whatsoever, people who have been dead for thousands of years can actually reveal their family relationships through these identical stretches of DNA. Basically, the longer these identical stretches are, the more closely related the parents were. It's like a giant biological puzzle. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how that works. Imagine taking two copies of an enormous book. If your parents are distant relatives, you inherit these scattered matching sentences from ancestors really far back in time. But if a child is born to siblings, they receive entire matching chapters because the parents inherited huge overlapping pieces from the exact same recent parents. Now, the biological danger here isn't just a moral one, it's statistical. Every single human carries harmful recessive variants. When you have these matching chapters, there's a vastly greater chance that identical, harmful variants from both sides will actually meet up, which leads to a much higher risk of developmental problems or weakened immunity. Now, obviously, ancient humans can see chromosomes, right? But they could absolutely observe those consequences over generations.
Which brings us to Section 3, Ancient Social Mating Networks.
So how exactly did they avoid it? Well, the biggest mistake we tend to make is assuming that camp size was the exact same thing as population size. A camp was small, for sure, but its social world, that was massive. Ancient humans weren't just sitting around in a cave doing nothing. They shared food and hospitality. They held these massive seasonal gatherings where multiple communities would reunite. They exchanged stone tools, shells, and pigments across enormous distances. And absolutely crucially, they moved partners between camps. A person might spend most of their days with maybe 25 people, but they actually belong to a social network of hundreds. Maintaining genetic diversity wasn't some kind of conscious anti-inbreeding program. It was just a natural side effect of being highly socially connected in order to survive. And this networking behavior goes back incredibly far. Just take a look at this data from a group of Neanderthals found in Shagyerska Cave over in Siberia, living roughly 54,000 years ago. Now, this was a tiny community of maybe 20 people, living right at the edge of the known world. You'd completely expect them to be entirely inbred. But look at the genetic diversity. The Y chromosomes, which are passed down by men, showed very low diversity. But the mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited through mothers, showed much greater diversity.
What this DNA actually proves is that even edge-of-the-world Neanderthals had women moving into their community from totally different groups, while the men mostly stayed put. So their everyday community was small, but their actual mating pool was so much larger.
All right, moving into section 4, the biology of aversion.
But, this wasn't all just logistical networking and swapping camps. Alongside those vast social networks, humans also developed some really intense psychological and cultural defenses against inbreeding. Nature basically installed this extremely aggressive sibling vibe right into our brains, which scientists call the Westermark effect. See, the brain doesn't actually need to sit there and calculate genetic relatedness. Instead, it just uses childhood familiarity as a rough biological clue. If you're raised in close domestic association with someone from a really early age, your brain dramatically reduces any later sexual attraction to them.
Put simply, the person stealing your food every single morning throughout your entire childhood is probably not your ideal reproductive partner. Communal childbearing and that intense early familiarity organically suppressed later sexual interest. It's an imperfect biological rule, sure, but it is a highly, highly effective one.
And then culture kind of took over right where biology left off. Early humans didn't just have one broad category for cousin. A parallel cousin might be treated socially as a strictly forbidden sibling, while a cross cousin might actually be considered a preferred partner. These strict kinship classifications meant that marriage wasn't just about individual romance or attraction. It was vital infrastructure. It systematically circulated partners between different groups. Because think about it, your partner's relatives suddenly became people you could safely trade with, visit, or even call upon during a brutal winter or crisis.
Which sets us up for section 5, when elites broke the rules. Because what happens when people finally settle down, build walls, and actually start hoarding resources? Well, when agriculture dawned, the rules shifted entirely. We start seeing these incredibly scandalous rule-breaking exceptions, but almost exclusively among ancient elites. This quote really hits the nail on the head. Power changes the rules. When land, livestock, and social status became tangible things you could inherit, lineages became fiercely, fiercely protective. The ruler became so sacred that crossing the incest boundary wasn't a taboo anymore. It was magically converted into a privilege that structured their political power and their exclusivity. So the crucial point here is that it creates this stark contrast in survival strategies. On one side, ordinary people relied on being networked and mobile, they shared their resources, and they consistently brought in genetic diversity as a basic survival mechanism. But the elites, the royalty, they became totally isolated and endogamous. They hoarded property, they hoarded status, and they purposely kept their genetics locked tight within their own palaces, just to maintain their grip on power. And the archaeology absolutely proves it, tracing this really clear timeline of extreme endogamy. We have these rare, isolated cases back in the Neolithic era in places like Israel and Malta. Then, roughly 5,000 years ago, deep inside the massive Newgrange monument in Ireland, we found the remains of a man whose parents were actually first-degree relatives, likely a ruling dynasty trying to maintain their sacred status. Fast forward to Bronze Age Italy, at Grotta della Monica, and DNA reveals a child born from a father-daughter union. And of course, in the Ptolemaic era of ancient Egypt, royal sibling marriage was practically a political requirement, just to maintain their supposed divine identity. But guys, we have to be extremely clear here. The DNA only records the reproduction. It does not record consent. Considering the massive power imbalances in these patriarchal royal lineages, especially in the cases involving children, these were non-consensual acts of abuse utilized to maintain power. Inventing some kind of romantic story about these unions is just incredibly irresponsible.
The thing is, because elites get the biggest monuments and the absolute best preserved tombs, their extreme inbreeding is wildly overrepresented in our modern imagination. Archaeology essentially preserved the scandal. But normality? Normality is the much larger and honestly far more important discovery here. Overwhelmingly, ancient populations were absolutely not casually ignoring close kinship. Our ancestors simply didn't survive by staying in their caves and picking the sibling who looked the least annoyed. They were highly socially intelligent networkers. The camp expanded through marriage. The village actively recruited outsiders. They inherently knew that partners needed to come from somewhere else, carrying new skills, completely unfamiliar immune variants, and basically serving as living proof that the world actually continued beyond the next ridge. They survived by leaving the cave. Which leaves us with this final thought.
For tens of thousands of years, humanity's absolute greatest survival advantage was our willingness to connect with unfamiliar faces, to build bridges with distant groups, and to realize that our true strength lay in expanding our circles, not shrinking them. So if our very existence as a species relied on reaching out beyond our own little bubbles, what does that mean for our deeply polarized modern world today? Something to think about. Keep expanding your circles and keep exploring. I'll see you in the next explainer.